Indonesia is ramping up its strategy to capture more of its commodity value chain. The latest mineral to face restrictions is bauxite. Elizabeth Nyo with more.
Indonesia's ban on raw bauxite exports began over the weekend. It's part of an overall strategy by President Joko Widodo to encourage more downstream processing of metals within the country. The ban is meant to encourage more investment into higher value-added activities onshore. Indonesia's success with nickel has emboldened the government's moves in this direction. It's managed to increase the value of its nickel exports by around 20 times over 7 years from the end of 2014. Indonesia has about 22% of global nickel reserves and 37% of the global supply. And it's been able to use tariffs and export bans to encourage more processing onshore. Companies have been beating a path to Indonesia's door to ensure they have an adequate supply of raw materials. The pool of resource riches is stronger now, with the drive to net zero emissions raising the demand for electric vehicles. And that in its turn is pushing up the demand for metals. Nickel makes up some 16% and aluminium 19% of the average weight in a regular 60 kilowatt-hour electric car battery. Chinese manufacturers are acutely aware of the strategic importance of this supply chain. The country's automakers already hold leading positions on the world stage, and with CATL and BYD, the top two Chinese manufacturers, ranking among the top three in the world easily. Now, this is helping to drive their hunger for forming partnerships to mine Indonesia's metal resources. For instance, a key input called mixed hydroxide precipitate made from nickel is currently being produced by at least 3 plants in the country. Another 26 facilities have been proposed, and of these, 23 have Chinese involvement. Other countries' companies are looking for a slice of the pie. Ford is investing $4.5 billion into a nickel processing plant. Hyundai has completed its first factory in the country to make cars. It's also partnered LG Energy to build a battery cell plant that is due to start producing next year. But whether the Indonesian government can repeat its nickel success with bauxite remains to be seen. While it's a key input for manufacturing aluminium and cement, widely used in industry, the country holds less than 4% of global reserves and accounts for less than 5% of global production.
And for more analysis on Indonesia's bauxite ban, we're joined now by Enrico Tanuwijaya. He's ASEAN economist at UOB. Good evening, Enrico. It's good to talk to you this evening. Now, this ban, it is meant to encourage more investment into higher value-added activities onshore in Indonesia. Indonesia has had some success, as Elizabeth was saying there, with its nickel exports, the control of them. But can the country treat bauxite in exactly the same way that it's treated nickel and expect similar results?
Yes, hi, Don. I think for bauxite, the amount of export is way smaller than nickel. So as a proportion of last year's total export, it is well below 0.5% at about $600 million export annually. This is against 292 billion total export, a record high for last year. So in short, I think they can afford to do this as long as the smelter preparation and the build-up is ready. So I think this is something that's going to be big if they are successful enough to add the value to turn bauxite into aluminum. And as you stated before, this will be a key component in the EV battery.
So the success of it rests partly on just how ready the smelter development is, as you just mentioned, Enrico, but Indonesia's ability to capture investment by just unilaterally banning bauxite exports notwithstanding, how narrow is this strategy? I mean, taking into account, as you were saying, just how the proportion. I mean, nickel is a much greater proportion as opposed to its reserves of bauxite. Does the country really need to perhaps broaden its strategy here for the metals sector as it moves to continue with this establishment of its downstream industry?
Yes, for sure. So I think bauxite will make up a key component as well once it's processed. And the downstreaming is the buzzword of the current government policy push. So I think for bauxite, the idea is that the number of smelter currently is very low, only at about 4, scattered across Kalimantan, Sumatra, the northern part, and the Riau archipelago. So they can only process about 14 million tons a year. Our capacity allows for close to 50 million. So we direly need a lot of smelting facilities to process this. But if you think in a greater scheme of things, in an ecosystem of electric vehicles, I think we may see next on copper development and downstreaming following nickel. And I'm pretty sure with China on the line, the bauxite smeltering will go pretty fast in terms of smelter development, adding value to the whole ecosystem of electric vehicle and, most importantly, electric battery.
Enrico, you mentioned China, and China is, of course, one of the largest consumers of Indonesia's bauxite supply. I mean, taking into account the economic growth in China is slowing, what impact could we see this export ban actually having on China's consumption of the metal, though?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, Dawn, I guess for a production facility that is centered in Indonesia, this is the right strategy because Indonesia has the bauxite component. I'm sure China also have. Indonesia currently stood at number 6. But in terms of the ecosystem, once certain companies from China already develop a nickel infrastructure, smeltering and processing, I think this is just natural for China to build next to it bauxite. So notwithstanding Chinese economic slowdown, I think the bigger forward picture is on developing a more sustainable EV production. And I believe Indonesia has 2-pronged stories to offer. Firstly, as a production hub, and this will entail the development of key components in EV battery, and then next as a consuming hub in itself. So I think this is also in the greatest interest of China, not only for diversification, but also to tap into the growing market of potential in Indonesia.
There is a lot of potential. And if you look up the value chain, Enrico, various companies also face impact from these moves. How will Indonesia's ban here with bauxite, how's that going to shake up the sector in the broader sense, in terms of the competitive landscape, given the metals involved are, as you say, key inputs for many industrial goods, apart from EVs, others as well?
Yeah, so I think in terms of bauxite, the planning here is how the government can provide the right incentives for all the prospective investors, because the key here is on the continuation of all the ecosystem parts. So I think this is not the end of it. In fact, this is just the second round of it. So I think the first success story of nickel that added value, in fact, if you add more base metals to it, so in 2014, the total base metal export, including the processed one, is less than 10 billion. Then suddenly in 2022, it jumped up to more than 41 billion. So I think the story is pretty clear. And, basing on this success story, I believe there will be more to come.
Enrico, thank you very much for that. Enrico Tanuwijaya, the ASEAN economist at UOB.